Thank you, Elena, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to see some of my friends in the pictures and some of my students as well. So that makes I don't know how you say it. Well, I won't say it now, but I'll say it later. I decided to go back to Lonzi when Diana invited me, and we were thinking of what I could talk about, and then I went through some Lonzi's texts, and actually I discussed with a PhD student of my colleague Lorenzo Bernini, Valeria Mercandino, who is a PhD student working on Lonzi. So I'm naming her here because what the text she suggested for these presentations and the discussions we had were very important for me. So I'm happy to nominate Valeria before I read my paper. So as I said, I decided to go back to Lonzi. I'm not a Lonzi expert, but I always found her texts and her works very, very inspiring and useful for somebody like me who works on philosophy and politics and feminism. So I decided to entitle this talk The Shared Risk of Politics, Carla Lonzi Revisited. And you will forgive me, but I will read so that I'm more confident. Maybe I will stop to clarify some of the things that I'm reading. For Italian feminist Carla Lonzi, conscious female identity, namely a Clitoridian identity that as such does not comply to the different vaginal roles predisposed for women by patriarchy, corresponds to a void, un vuoto, a blank mark in the phallocratic patriarchal culture. Aim of the peculiar separatist type of feminism Lonzi and her group Rivolta Femminile developed during the early 70s in Italy was to allow this void to emerge, both in consciousness-raising groups and in specific political stances they took within the larger Italian feminist movement. For her, for Lonzi, for them, for the group, it was not a matter of filling the void, but to find words that could allow women to express themselves by not denying the void, in ways that were not complicit with patriarchy or not subsumable under its seas, as the eternal irony of the community of which Hegel speaks when discussing women's unpolitical nature within the polis. According to Lonzi, there are many ways in which patriarchy seeks to entrap female subjectivity, and, of course, as you all probably know, women's emancipation is, according to Lonzi, another strategy of entrapment, as the family had been in the past. The main political problem for Lonzi and her group lies in the fact that female identity is an alterity that can be easily turned into something functional to the patriarchal system. As if, one could dare to say, the specific form of subordination destined to women would always imply a vicinity, a familiarity that could not be easily turned into conflict or contraposition. If, as Hegel had affirmed, women are the eternal irony of the community, thereby meaning they are subjects who remain eternally distant, not involved, foreign, to use a term later adopted by Virginia Woolf to define women, to the men-only political sphere of the polis. It is also true that according to the Hegelian cunning of reason, they can be co-opted, included, domesticated to specifically fundamental functions within the polis. The structural inclusion of women in the polis is a patriarchal move of domestication, which in fact encloses them within the walls of the house in the strictly private sphere. In order to avoid the risk of another domestication that could come along with mere emancipation, feminism should not be content with the simple externality or alterity of women to the world ruled by men. According to Lonzi, there is always a risk of being co-opted, subsumed, recovered in that horizon and be functional, even supportive of it. So the separate adventure of feminism, therefore, as Lonzi and her group intended it, was more ambitious than that. It had to do with what we would call, in Arendtian terms, I'm always indebted to Hannah Arendt and her reflections on politics. So it had to do what we would call, in Arendtian terms, a new beginning based on unpredictability rather than simply opposition, vindication, or rebellion. Yet, to continue the Arendtian parallel, it was a new beginning, a risk one could not undertake alone. Lonzi, in a 1977 collective text significantly entitled È già politica, it's already politics, more or less, could be translated, states that since she was very young, she felt a desire to participate to public life and tried available alternatives: university, Marxism and political activism, art critique. Yet all these worlds in the end did not satisfy her, or as she put it, and here I translate, forgive me the translation, quote, I found some degree of consideration in them, but no resonance, nor an atmosphere that could allow a displaying of myself. I had to admit that I was not able to grasp a point of encounter between the world and me. The junction between two incompatible entities could not rely simply on my individual will. End of quote. When feminism came into the scene, Lonzi felt it was something different from Marxism, from art critique, or academic career. A scene where a displaying of the self was possible, independently from her own individual will. But in what sense? In another text, her diary, Taci, anzi parla, Lonzi notes that to move from an aspiration to a reality is what feminism is all about. Passare da un'aspirazione a una realtà è stato per me il contenuto del femminismo. The emphasis I here perceive is on the concrete dimension that feminism brings about. The shift from aspiration to reality refers probably to the fact that in feminist groups, even small ones, the sense of unreal existence for women within the polis, the Hegelian eternal irony of the community, fades away. Along with it, fades away also the domesticated existence of women within the polis, not authentic, not responded to the real self. This domesticated existence is put into abeyance, suspended for a while, allowing to experience new and unexpected dimensions of the self. The radical turn operated by Lonzi with her political reflections regarding women's identity consisted, as you all know, in affirming that only Clitoridian femininity could resist cooptation, functional domestication within patriarchy. But what does she really mean by Clitoridian femininity? Is it a biological feature, a cultural one, or both? It is interesting to note that Lonzi calls this specific posture as the, and here I quote, again I translate, perhaps not completely faithfully to the Italian. So Lonzi calls this specific feminine posture as the assumption of a non-compliant sexual identity, una identità sessuale non conforme. In her own words, I quote, the identity that stems from clitoris starts from a nothing, a cultural void, and progressively constitutes itself through an acceptance of oneself that becomes one's own identity, but cannot fix itself in a role, lest falling back into vaginality. And it cannot reveal itself in the cultural world, but in the identity that stems directly from the assumption of a non-compliant sexual identity, which alone enables the authentic and complete utterance of the word I. This I, as cultural void, is the premise for a rediscovery of our body, and therefore of a culture of our own. Yet, says Lonzi, each woman is alone in facing this void, and alone is she in measuring it at the risk of madness. And again the quote, "It is barely bearable. It is the risk of losing one's reason or losing one's mind," of which Maria Grazia Chinese speaks. Maria Grazia Chinese was another member of Rivolta Femminile. How many losses, end of quote, how many losses of mind do we know in the history of women or women's lives? How painful it is to recognize the void and face it. One could even say that any feminist endeavor that does not recognize this void is bound to fail by being co-opted or subsumed under the symbolical predominance of patriarchy or phallocentrism. Yet the recognition of the void is deeply problematic. It can lead to madness if dealt with individually in solitude by an I whose existence is unreal or perceived as such. Lonzi alludes in all her works at the suffering and difficulty of going through the deconstruction of one's identity alone, being always at risk of losing oneself. Yet, in her text, Egia Politica is a later text, is a 1977 text, she tells positively of the possibility of starting the painful, difficult process of recognition and expression of the real self together with other women, by way of sharing the risk of losing oneself. This is why I think she names as immediately political the small, apparently private and limited experience of her group, Rivolta Femminile. Facing the void with others, naming it and learning to deal with it through the rough yet productive discovery of the Clitoridian identity for women, it's already politics. Feminism is, perhaps, a non-painful way out of the solitude and sense of uncertainty produced by the awareness of the void. My claim is that the pain is avoided insofar as the endeavor is already political, and instead of producing loss of reason, it can produce a precious sense of reality and vitality. Lonzi recounts of how she realized she can take the risk of facing the void only insofar as she knew she was not alone in doing it. I quote, "It is a risk I realized I can take and live only insofar as I know it shared. Feminism has given me this. This risk is my sense of femininity." È un rischio in cui mi sono accertata di essere capace di vivere ora che lo so condiviso. Il femminismo mi ha dato questo. Tale rischio è il mio senso della femminilità. Therefore, void and solitude are not substituted by a full feminine identity, which is at high risk of being co-opted, subsumed, as we have seen. They are instead filled by the group, which is nothing more than the shared risk of one's new feminist identity. The group has shared risk towards something unpredictable. It's already politics, è già politica, insofar as it is not an individual, but a collective or plural, as Hannah Arendt would say, effort towards the transformation of reality. Feminism as the shared risk of femininity is Lonzi's precious heritage, not only because she names identity as risk, thereby avoiding all possible essentialist traps, but also because she roots this risk in the corporeal reality of clitoris. This is what distinguishes, I think, Italian feminism from second-wave feminism in general, an anti-essential relation to the body which gives rise to a non-essential bodily materialism. The assumption of this void roots itself in a feminine specificity, the clitoris, a bodily part that has nothing to do with reproduction and is therefore alien to the phallogocentric economy of women's domestication, thereby bringing the body heavily into the scene and making it the center of a feminist rearticulation of women's identity. The clitoris as a vehicle towards freedom rather than liberation. I could phrase it better by using the words of Linda Zerilli, who in an article on the Milan Bookstore Collective says, I quote, "While in liberal democracies like our own, freedom is defined in highly individualistic terms, housed in constitutionally guaranteed rights, and experienced as something that begins where politics ends, for Italian feminists of the 70s and 80s, freedom is something quite different. It is a creative and collective practice of world building, fundamentally inaugural in character, that establishes irreducibly contingent, politically significant relationships among women as sexed beings who otherwise have none, apart from their place in the masculine economy of exchange." End of quote. According to Zerilli, Italian feminists succeed in disentangling or separating freedom from rights, and saying that far from being a fight for equal rights, feminism is the practice of sexual difference. What does this mean? It means simply that women's freedom can be experienced only within a politically contingent context where women refer to other women in order to empower their symbolic autonomy and dignity. Zerilli notes that this practice is an expression of freedom and as such world building. The Arendtian tone of this statement cannot be underestimated. The relational and discursive dimension of the feminist groups is very close to what Arendt considers as crucial to the dimension of the vita activa. Human freedom can happen only in a plural public space where people act in concert. When they do so, actors not only realize their potential humanity, but contribute to create and foster a common world. I would like to push this Arendtian resonance a bit further by saying that what renders political the feminist practice of sexual difference, as Zerilli says, or the risk of feminine identity, as Lonzi says, is their being productive of new positive realities. They're giving life to unexpected words and deeds that in turn contribute to augment, enlarge, and amend the sphere of the political. The unexpected move of Italian feminism, first with Lonzi and then with the thought of sexual difference, was to enlarge this political space by politicizing the body in unexpected materialistic terms, not in order to just liberate the body and its sexuality, but to confer a meaning of concrete existence to women's freedom. A freedom that is no longer conceived in liberal, individualistic terms, insofar as the liberal matrix is too permeated of masculine features to be fit for women, whose identity is either assimilated to that of man, the trap of emancipation, according to Lonzi, or refers to the subordinate domesticated role women play in patriarchy, the trap of the house and family. A freedom that has generative traits that can no longer be thought of in terms of individual, private freedom fostered by individual rights, but rather in terms of a common practice, a shared risk, a new beginning. I am at present working on, again, Arendt and the concept of public happiness, namely the fact that to act politically means to experience happiness. She refers to it in a book on revolution, praising American revolutionaries of the 18th century. My wager is that Arendt invents this concept in order to give strength to her idea of political action. But why does she call this happiness? Not only to pay a tribute to Thomas Jefferson, who, as you all know, inserted the famous right to the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, but because happiness for her has to do with the satisfaction of a primary human need, that of being seen and heard, confirmed, recognized in one's own reality. Arendt, in On Revolution, quotes extensively also another founding father of the American Republic, John Adams, who in a text of 1790 says, when discussing the human motivations for politics, that each individual, I quote, be it woman or man, young or old, rich or poor, is strongly actuated by a desire to be seen, heard, talked of, approved and respected by the people about him and with him, his knowledge. Arendt evokes and philosophically meditates on some inaugural scenes of modernity relatively to the rediscovery of action and public freedom. These scenes are always relational scenes, this is my claim, in which what comes to the fore is a dimension of dependence among political actors rather than the site of sovereign, self-referential and narcissistic individualism. What is at play in political action is above all the fundamental desire to have recognized by others one's singular existence. This recognition, which can only be shared, public, relational, in Arendt's work significantly takes the name of happiness. Moreover, Arendt, at the outset of chapter 5 of her text, The Human Condition, in order to ground her idea of a connection between action and happiness, quotes Dante, who says, and I open the quote, I think the text is Monarchia, but I'm not sure. Every doer, insofar as he does, takes delight in doing. Since everything that is desires its own being, this is Dante before Spinoza, and since in action the being of the doer is somehow intensified, delight necessarily follows. According to Arendt, we all have an impulse to appear to others and to have confirmed from them our own existence. To sum up briefly and superficially Arendt's thought, her peculiar notion of political action is rooted in this existential need for one's own reality, confirmed and strengthened by the presence and company of others. It is not difficult to detect behind this original notion of politics the specter of totalitarian regime with its derealization of the common world through ideology and terror. In its virtuous participatory sense, this is what politics provide, a scene for mutual recognition that reinforces the reality of one's existence, as if the human could be defined as a being in need of a public, shared, theatrical recognition that only politics can provide. The shared risk of femininity, of which Lonzi speaks, could not express better, in my view, this Arendtian notion of politics. And I think it is not by chance, as I said, that Lonzi calls the experience of losing oneself, the void, and the simultaneous finding of one's authentic self within feminism, politics. The bodily root of this politics, as I have tried to argue, is not an essentialist root, yet it is indispensable in order to endure the void and simultaneously avoid new patriarchal traps. And in turn, the feminine identity which stems from feminism is not simply an identity in the essentialist sense, but an identity that consists in the reality of existing with others, yet in one's own singularity. This is why when this recognition happens in public context, not necessarily highly institutional contexts, but also in very small daily ones, there is a positive feeling attached to it. Dante calls it delight, Arendt calls it happiness, Lonzi refers to it as the shift from aspiration to reality. To me, feminism has a lot to do with this public happiness, the happiness of coming out of the invisible sphere of the private, transforming the private into a public space, transforming the body into something political. The practice of sexual difference is, in the end, a collective politicization of the body in order to open up spaces for women's unexpected and different freedom. So this would be my paper, but I would like to leave you and maybe leave also Angie with this thing that if I had to say something provocative about today's fate of feminism and fate of women's bodies, or the bodily materialism that Italian feminism put into the scene, what I see today is that instead of being politicized, the body is today biopoliticized. There is no more politics involved, but only what is called the politics of life itself, a politics of the body as something that has to be either exploited or sexually connotated, or from a point of view, for example, of the maternal body as a body that has to produce milk, for example. This is something that I've written about the extensive biopolitics of breastfeeding as a new trap for a female body, as a neoliberal biopolitical trap for women's bodies. So I am really, and this is a question that I leave to you, I don't know how much I would pay to know what Lonzi would say about today's fate of women's bodies in feminism. Thank you.
I want to respond to a few words from Olivia's paper. Unpredictability, and I want you to come back to that. Risk, cultural void, facing the void with others, filled by the group, and share the risk of feminism. And of course, Arendt's beta activity. Yes, thank you. Also, in relation to what I was doing with the Liverpool project, it was really Barbara Loftus's story of her mother in Nazi Berlin. And that gave rise to an experimental project, a kind of heterotopic autobiography of one of our students. And a refugee from Uganda. When we got back the scripts of us trying to piece together different pieces of Jane's story, the text was so raw, I don't think we will ever be able to publish anything without seriously editing it. It was really all out. Her story anyway. Two comments really. First of all, the idea of risk and what is at risk. It seems to me, the linguist tells me, that we are thinking about risk and what is the opposite of risk? Non-risk, risk-free situation. We're thinking in terms of two signifiers that are facing each other, don't leave much room for anything else. So it seems to me that we must start thinking, as Stigler says, pharmacologically, what we can do with the idea of risk today. What are we risking if we speak or if we don't speak?
This is the first comment that I have to answer.
Yeah. It seems to me that depoliticization today is the loss of desire to communicate and to expose ourselves in language. Do you have to say anything on that?
Yeah. What is at risk? I think that I was talking before, I was having a glass of wine and talking to Francesco Ventrella, who said that I think we all have, we who teach in universities and have to deal with young people that are 18, 19, 20, and talk about politics, or not only politics, but the political, or what is political engagement, or what is political action. At least for me, it is, I always face an audience that opens the eyes and looks at me and thinks, what is she saying? What is she talking about? They have no idea, not only no idea, no clue. In Italy, it's very easy when you say the word politica, they immediately think of corruption, our government. So please leave this. It seems that their faces are telling you, please leave this out of this room. We don't want to talk about it. So I think connected to this, and I was talking to Francesco before, they are so unwilling to risk, or so unwilling to put into, to suspend their certainties of all kinds. Not only the certainties of their, or maybe of their wealthy lives, or comfortable lives, but always unwilling to put aside or to deconstruct their ideologies, or what they consider a truth that somebody else taught them, or that they learn, or that they think it's a good way of representing reality. They are unwilling to take the risk, of at least thinking that things could be different, the risk of transformation, the risk of change. They are totally unwilling to do this. And I think this has a lot to do also with the times in which we are living, the times of end of history, so to say, times of the eternal now, as if we are living in an eternal now. I always tell the students, for example, to shock them, I say, the only history that we know is the fall-winter collection of, or spring, summer-spring collection. That's the only, time change that we perceive in our so-called privileged Western lives. For me, I don't know if in your question there was sort of a critical idea of risk, but I think risk has, in this sense, at least in the sense that Lonzi speaks about, it is of course something that involves maybe suffering. Suffering maybe is too a big word, I don't know. That involves some kind of pain of some kind. But at the same time, it's not the risk of total uncertainty. Or it is an uncertainty that I think, at least so I perceive it when I read Lonzi, that goes towards something that is expected as better. Not in the sense of a great future for the humanity, but it is this breach that hopes to end up in something that is better. So at least this risk is not the risk of the risico society of which Ulrich Beck speaks, for example. Yes. So politics and risk, I think, are connected, and because students or young people, not all, but most, seem unwilling to take risk, they also seem unwilling to think positively about politics in this, of course, in this sense, not in the sense of parliamentary politics.
Indeed. The other thing I noticed when you were talking, when I was reading this, actually, I cannot lie, I read it beforehand. Lonzi's writing is autobiographical, and it is also quite profound and sincere in the sense that she's trying to understand what eluded her in her own past. And I'm reminded at this point of Lisa Baraitser's reading of Luisa Passerini's autobiography, saying that what Passerini is trying to do in her autobiography is not actually witness her own past, but find out the missing elements, what she did not witness. She's looking to find evidence of what else was going on at her time. And this is pretty much, it seems to me, a contemporary concern for us. When I was looking at 70s, 60s, 70s photography art, this was quite something because it's there in discovering, in actually getting in touch with this intergenerational perspective of feminism. That is, it's not just pleasing, I can place myself today as a feminist in relation to the past. I think there is an integral, ethical, political, radical dimension which must not be forgotten. It's generational in two senses, therefore, connecting to pasts we have not experienced, as well as generating our own becoming and our own knowledge. And I'm also thinking, from the experience of teaching very non-traditional and rather unprivileged students who do not have the experience of art or do not think that art and artistic creation is de facto in life, who have not actually, some of them have not even been to an art gallery even. It seems that we need to have a generosity towards our own past, especially to our own failures. This seems to me that what my students are asking me to provide as a thinking space. So what these feminists are doing when they're thinking about their bodies, about their pasts, about their false starts, is that they're trying to create a better understanding of themselves there. I'm thinking here of Sila Ben Habib's question, the time of women, not so much Kristeva. And Sila Ben Habib asks, aren't women allowed to pull down the curtains for a while, take some time out? In a culture that wants women to get on from one stage to the next unfailingly and on time, being able to say, I failed, I took time off, I didn't do well, I'm reconnecting, I'm restarting, my God, this is precious. And it seems to me that all the feminist endeavors of the past always see this dimension of recouping lost time or time that has not been ours. Am I on the right track here?
I pick up this last part, and I think that this idea of the separatism, or what you call women only, is it? Could we translate the separate? Francesco, I look at you. Separatism. You say separatism because I found also this women only groups, the saying women only, but I prefer separatism. And I think this separatism was a sort of this, let's stay out for a while and discuss among ourselves and see what comes out from this. And what you're saying, quoting Ben Habib, reminds me exactly what one of my students who is in Benazir, Ludmila Bazzoni, who you know, when she was telling me how they were working in this group, in this collective, Benazir. And when, for example, in some situations in Verona or in Italy, they were called to intervene in a conference or as young feminists, she was telling me, sometimes I feel that we have nothing to say insofar as we perceive that the whole horizon is so saturated with things and with images and with ideas that we fear that we need to step back for a while and think and discuss. So this is true. This is totally true, and And I agree. But looking at the world at this moment, I think that I must say, confess that sometimes also in a still very patriarchal country as Italy, sometimes I think that what we need is like to go back to, early 20th century suffragists, Sometimes I get this feeling that you have to start from all the way back then.
I have the same feeling from Greece, for Greece again.
And so sometimes I'm really baffled and I don't know where to turn and what to do, because of course I think it's very important to have queer theory and queer art and queer reflections, but sometimes I feel there is a huge gap between those levels of theory and society in its concrete functions. And as a matter of fact, when I wrote an article for Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, an article that was so popular that after writing an article you think, well, maybe it's better to write one article and have so much impact than write books and books that nobody reads. But in that article I was intervening about the fact of demonstrating against the Berlusconi government, like that Se non ora quando, the big movement that decided to go and demonstrate. There was a big debate in Italian feminism whether to go or not to go, whether to protest or not protest, and I thought it was silly not to go and not to demonstrate. I mean, of course, everyone goes in the square and demonstrates with their own ideas, but it was. So in that article, I said there is a gap between Italy. We shift from Foucault to American Idol, to give an idea. There's like either Foucault or the lowest cultural products that the masses consume, basically. So I don't remember why I was saying this, but
in response to the idea of intergenerational.
Yes, well,
connecting and looking at the past for inspiration or rereading critically.
Yeah.
Final point, and I want your opinion on this one. It's beautiful. The idea of being surprised or being able to be surprised in our end. Can you expand a bit on that? It seems to me, and the point we were trying to make we are trying to make in the if not now, when, the edited volume, is that we have been reduced, politically speaking, to kind of utilitarian conservation of life, more than playing with it or being happy or pursuing the vita activa. And time and again in your paper you come back to this kind of openness, if you like, and disposition to being surprised, which is a contradiction in terms if it's a disposition to be surprised. How do you create that? It seems that our end is pointing to something very controversial there. It's not self-subversion in the kind of psychoanalytic sense of the 70s. It's something more deeply ethical and relational, is it not? And this, to me, seems to be what is we should be examining and pursuing right now, along with the value of experience.
Yeah.
If the neoliberal attitude is what's the value in it, what is in it for me, how much does it cost, what does it translate to, we're missing something out.
Yes.
So the idea of being surprised.
Well, this idea of being surprised, or the idea of, she calls even the political action is a miracle, she says, something that happens as unexpected. And there is this beautiful sentence by Carla Lonzi in Let's Speak on Hegel, where she says, we care that our future be unexpected rather than exceptional. And I always love that sentence because I think it's so, full of promise, so to say. But what I think is interesting, and what I'm trying to do in this research on public happiness, also in the path started by Adriana Cavarero with relating narratives, with this idea of telling one story, of this identity that comes from the outside and not from within. So you have this desire to be confirmed by somebody else who tells you your story. Something that comes from the
Something has been disturbed.
But what I think is interesting, and Arendt puts it here and there in her texts, and I think it's also for her an unfinished sort of project, is that whenever people act, participate politically, they feel, they experience this, let's call it a positive feeling. You can call it happiness, you can call it enthusiasm, you can call it something else. But she says, you don't know it beforehand. You cannot plan it, you cannot, or you plan to act for an end. The Americans planned to act in order to get independent from Great Britain, or the French resistance was the plan, the end was to liberate France from German occupation. But while you act, while you do something, you perceive, you experience something that was not included in the original plan. I mean, you thought that you would do it because you had to, because it was an ethical duty, because it was, something you had to do to liberate yourself. And she says freedom, because she also calls this freedom, as something different from liberation. So liberation is something that, ends and sort of ends in, I don't know the word, ends an occupation or ends a situation of difficulty. But freedom is something different. It's an excessive product of the political action. It's not utilitarian end of a political action. So this is also something that she says even those who fought during the French resistance, they were surprised by the pleasure that they had in not in killing or using the arms, but in acting together. And so I think this is a precious heritage that we get from Arendt, that you find. I think this is interesting because whenever you find memoirs or autobiographies that speak of political engagement of any kind, you have traces of this. You can find in the most different places. You find traces of this pleasure, of this happiness, and I think. And of course, Arendt criticizes the fact that happiness has become, already at the origins of the Declaration of Independence, a private thing, a pursuit of private happiness, a pursuit of private success or career or money. And this privatization of all of the virtues is what we are badly experiencing today, I think. We totally lack a political, also political imagination. Mm-hmm.